Hi, DJ Jerry here. Thanks for joining me on Learning of Chemistry. So today the topic that we are going to focus on is experimental chemistry, the very first topic. So before I go into details, that allows me to give you a big picture of what this topic is about, right? Of course, we do a lot of experiment, but when we step into a lab, what are the most common thing that we see are chemicals that are in the solution or liquid form. And of course, we also talk about gas. So in this chapter, we want to focus mainly on how do we measure volume, how do we collect gas, and how do we dry the gas. Right. So with this big picture, hopefully it helps you to relate better and then make your learning of chemistry more effective. At least you know what you're looking for. And in my notes, I'm just focusing on the main points. Of course, there could be more than that. All right. But this is the main thing that may be tested and more important. So I'm helping you to prioritize what needs to be learned. So let's move on to this topic. All right. Today we're talking about experimental. So let's look at measuring volume. Of course, when you want to measure the volume of gas, all right, we use the gas syringe. Very straightforward. All right. And mention there is a difference between liquid and solution. All right. Basically, solution means it's a mixture. Right. We dissolve in water. Whereas, okay, whereas liquid is pure. Okay, it is not a very big difference for combined chem students, but it is very important later part for the pure chem who is doing electrochemistry. Right? So we thought dissolving in water, then we give the solution. So this is the main physical state of chemical that we see in our lab. So let's move on to this. When we want to measure, we divide it into estimate or accurate. So when words like estimate rough, we use measuring cylinder. Okay, and in Sec 3, we upgrade ourselves, right? More accurate measurement, we learn about burette and your pipette. Right, if you look at a diagram between these two, the main difference is that the burette has a lot of graduation marks, so you can measure different amount of volume. But pipette is more on fixed. It has only one marking, so it's normally a fixed volume. And normally our lab is 25.0. So we look out for the volume 25.0, then we go for pipette. If not, it will generally be a burette, right? Of course, burette that technically is more accurate, can measure up to two decimal place, whereas pipette can only be up to one decimal place, right? And in that topic, we also talk about the collection of gas. Volume, we already settled, so we're not going to cover this part here. We already settled the gas range, the volume. So let's talk about, all right, there are a few here, these three methods: displacement of water, downward delivery, upward delivery. Right. So most important thing, what are the criteria you're looking at? So you can see more dense, then we use downward. How do we know more dense? Actually, we check the MR. So later topic, you will learn how to calculate relative molecular mass. More dense means higher MR, right? Less dense means lower MR. For this must be either insoluble or slightly soluble because the gas will have to pass through water. If the gas is soluble, means after it pass through water, you will not see any gas anymore. Right? So these are some of the examples of the different type of gas. And do take note, all right, we don't close, there's no closing of the gas jar. Okay, because as the gas comes in, right, air is coming out. Right. It's sometimes it's also the outward delivery, downward delivery is also sometimes known as a displacement of air. Because before there's gas, there's air inside. So when the gas come in, take occupy the space, it will slowly displace the air out. Gas range is used to measure volume of gas. Right. Sometimes the displacement of water can also be used. And drying agent, basically we need to know that drying is not a reaction. Okay, when we dry our clothes, there's no reaction. It's just a physical process. So we don't want it to react with the gas. Therefore, you see, for sulfuric acid, concentrated sulfuric acid, ammonia we cannot because ammonia is the only alkaline gas in our syllabus. If we pass through ammonia gas with acid, okay, as we have learned in the lower side, acid and alkaline will react. So we don't want them to react. So normally for ammonia gas, we use quicklime. Right? So just know these two, mainly these two, concentrated sulfuric acid, quicklime. Right? Technically, quicklime also cannot use for acidic gas because it will react. We don't want the acid alkaline reactions. We just only want to dry the gas. If it's a neutral gas, then whichever we use doesn't matter. All right. Hope this will help you, and this will be the end of this chapter on the experimental chemistry. Catch you in the next chapter. Thank you very much.